Biden-Harris administration attempted to redefine Title IX and basically reinterpreted it to flip it on its head. So instead of protecting women and girls, it actually endangers them in schools by opening locker rooms, bathrooms, showers, living facilities to students of the opposite sex.
Happening now, the Fifth Circuit of Appeals in New Orleans is hearing a court case regarding Title IX rules between the state of Louisiana and the U.S. Department of Education. And in this case, the Rapides Parish School Board stands at the forefront of the arguments. The court case comes as a result of the Biden administration's passage of new rules and regulations for Title IX. Title IX is a civil rights law originally passed in 1972 to protect women by banning discrimination in schools and school programs on the basis of a person's sex. The new rules expanded the protections to also include individuals who identify with a gender different from their biological sex, most notably those in the LGBTQ+ community. A change the Rapides Parish School Board does not agree with, saying it would force schools across the country to embrace a controversial gender ideology. And according to the legal counsel representing RPSB, schools would also be forced to police that same ideology.
It also imposes an overbroad speech code on school districts where they have to police speech surrounding gender identity to force the use of things like feeling-based pronouns in violation of First Amendment rights. I mean, the school districts have an obligation to enforce them or they will lose federal funding.
The court case is still underway, but according to Hoffman, they're pushing for the court to reaffirm the pause on the new rules. You can find our latest coverage on the matter over on our website.